photography on the two towers. So I have
Good morning. Good morning. Is this on?
degrees undergrad.
Not on.
Oh no, try again. Say something.
Hello. It's not on.
Why don't you use one of the handhelds for now?
Yeah.
Our usual
Hello.
setup.
All right, I have the power now. Good morning and welcome to our community discussion today. Please come forward, fill the front seats. Can't sit in the back ones because they're set up for the service which will follow this program this morning. My name is Wayne Jennings. I'm the coordinator for today's discussion on diversity and inclusion. Given this subject, we hope to challenge you with new information or perspectives on issues that you'll continue to think about and perhaps even act on. We have a mission in this church to search and to serve. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the continuing search for truth and the importance of serving others. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community, to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all who attend. We chose today's topic for discussion because diversity and racial justice are extremely important to a healthy, growing, and diverse congregation. Last fall, diversity was one of the highest priorities of this congregation when we asked congregants their priorities as we go into the new era following the merger of the Unitarian Society and First Unitarian Church to form the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. This year, our racial justice leadership team is undertaking a program in which we are exploring the role of race and ethnicity in our own individual lives, our congregation, and our community. It is called the Beloved Conversations and consists of a weekend retreat followed by 8 weekly 2-hour small group deep discussions. Over 40 members of our congregation are currently participating. Our goal is to create more racial justice in our personal lives, our congregation, and our community. Now for our speakers. John Paul Stevens is an associate professor of organizational behavior at Case Weatherhead School of Management. Originally from Trinidad and Tobago, he studies how diverse people work in groups and the complex ways on how they relate to each other and coordinate their efforts. He's done lots of additional research on how behaviors, emotions, and perceptions people have, how they shape their resulting performance, and whether at work or in other environments. His research has been widely published and recognized nationally in many journals, including the Oxford Handbook of Organizational Scholarship. He also sits on many organizational boards such as the Academy of Management Discoveries and the Center for Positive Organizations. If that isn't enough, he's also been nominated for many teaching and mentoring awards at the Case Weatherhead School of Management. Our other speaker is Randall McShepard. Randall McShepard is the Vice President of Public Affairs and Chief Talent Officer for RPM International, a world leader in specialty coatings. His corporate and community leadership has been widely recognized locally and nationally in community engagement, broad leadership, volunteerism, philanthropy, and support of NEOs, nonprofit organizations. He's personally contributed time and expertise to organizations committed to education, health, the arts, and a variety of civic activities. The list is too long to be specific. Mr. McShepard co-founded and serves as the board chair of Policy Bridge, a public policy think tank, which recently published a paper titled Missing in Action, an analysis of Black leadership and the challenges that impede success and impact. He has also served as trustee for the Baldwin Wallace University and the Gunn Foundation. So we will start with some presentations, PowerPoint presentations, and Mr. McShepard will go first. And started.
All right.
This, yeah, we'll just have to.
We have our usual precise.
All right.
Oh, you have your, yeah.
I can turn
turn
this
on
on.
your-
There you go.
Voila. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you all so much for being here. As you all heard, my name is Randall McShepard. I am extremely glad to be here and to discuss this important topic, which I feel like I have lots of experience with. I have that experience, first of all, as a lifelong Clevelander who grew up sort of wrestling with the east side, west side divide. Also, my first year of high school was the first year of busing. So that whole situation around being all of a sudden from a predominantly black school to a predominantly white, or I should say half and half, when they bused kids from the west side. I also have served, you heard the list of community events or activities being extensive. I've served on 40 nonprofit boards over the last 25 years. So I can tell you that I have seen and discussed issues of diversity and inclusion in every shape, size, format that you can imagine with those experiences. I'm also the only executive of color at RPM International Incorporated. So the whole dealing with being the only one in the room is something that I face every day. By the way, 19 years ago when I started at RPM, I was the only person of color on the corporate headquarters campus. So all of this is quite important to me, and it all hits home. I personally, I'd be remiss if I also didn't mention, as was announced, that Policy Bridge is a public policy think tank that I and two colleagues co-founded to address public policy issues and how they affect communities of color. So we have been writing extensively for the last 15 years, research reports, and hosting community forums to talk about issues of diversity and inclusion and how public policy can better provide opportunities for people of color. And I personally think that diversity, inclusion, and leadership are among the most critical issues facing organizations, facing corporations, and facing governmental entities worldwide. I think it's what we're wrestling with right now globally, to a great extent, has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. A lack of an understanding, lack of appreciation, lack of empathy, those kinds of things. So I do want to just pause and say, you hear a lot about diversity, inclusion, and people often wrestle with, well, what's the difference between diversity and inclusion? I once heard an author give an answer to that question that I thought summed it up great. She said, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. So I thought that made a lot of sense. I mean, I can tell you, as a person of color, I've been in many parties where I was a wallflower because no one would dance with me, no one would talk, no one would, it was very uncomfortable. It can be very uncomfortable. So, with that, I'll move quickly. I know we only have 10 to 12 minutes, and I certainly want to make time for my new best friend, JP, to share his perspective. So, I wanted to just say, in my mind, there are dimensions of diversity that are, some are conspicuous, right? So, you look at racial, you look at gender, you look at age, you can pretty much walk in a room and quickly ascertain, okay, there's diversity. There's a good number of women, there's a good number of men, or there's people of color or not, or there's a younger crowd or there's an older crowd, right? And that's easily identifiable and easier to address. I think where it gets a little gray is when you start looking at those inconspicuous types of things that affect diversity. So, socioeconomic, you don't always know how well or well off or not so much a person is just by looking at them. I think about my employment at RPM. You walk into a room, you really don't know who has the leadership authority, even though people may have leadership titles. They don't have the leadership authority. And then issues like LGBTQ, you you can't walk in a room and say this person is, this person isn't, but all of those are important factors to consider when we talk about dimensions of diversity. I thought the best way for me to spend my short time is to just give you a few personal stories and experiences that I think speak to the kinds of challenges that we as a society have to wrestle with, and certainly I applaud you all for making this a critical topic for your speaker series. Many of you have heard of the Union Club of Cleveland?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Union Club of Cleveland was established in 1872, and the interesting thing about the Union Club that most people shudder about is that it wasn't until 1980, 1981 that the first woman member was accepted. That woman was Karen Horn, who was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank at the time, and she was invited to join the Union Club, and at that time there was a policy, 1980, that women still had to enter in the back of the building.
Sorry?
And she said, yeah, well, exactly, that's what she said. And she said, if you think, as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank, that I'm gonna walk in anybody's back door. So they immediately changed the policy and allowed all women to come in the front door and allowed her to be the first female board member. A year later, Steve Mentor, God bless his soul, former president of the Cleveland Foundation, became the first African American member. And why am I telling you all this? Well, in 2015, I became the first African American president of that club in the 143-year history. And as you can imagine, there were many of these issues that you see highlighted that I had to wrestle with. I had to wrestle with age diversity. The average age was 64 when I took the post. 2 years later, when my term ended, we had brought that down to 56, so we felt pretty good about that.
What was your age at the time?
I'm sorry?
What was your age at the time?
Oh, I was less than that. We had 9% women. After my 2 years, we had doubled that to 18% women. And we had 2% minority. We had increased that to 5% minority. I guess I learned in my time there that leaders actually help to perpetuate bad practices. So when I think about the Union Club, and I think about the fact that not only were African Americans not invited, not only were Hispanics not invited, but I worked for an Irish Catholic family who said their grandfather tried to join 40, 50 years ago and he was not welcome. Jewish people were not welcome. I can go on and on. So it was a good old boys club in every sense of the word, and it was quite the opportunity for me to be able to lead change and to take on some of these tough challenges. So that's one piece of it. This next one, they talked about the most recent Policy Bridge report titled Missing in Action. This is a report that I solely wrote. We usually write as a team, but I felt compelled to give my personal unplugged perspective on black leadership in Cleveland. And I was really thinking about the importance of being inclusive of all phases of leadership in the community, not just government. Because especially in the African American community, I felt that the pathway to leadership was clear for people of color, but the pathway to leadership was also limited because you can only have so many elected officials. And I was saying, hey, I'm a business guy who's trying to be a leader, and we're not looking in neighborhoods, we're not looking for civic leaders that also have a critical role to play. It was a very controversial report, front page of the Plain Dealer, so much so that the City Club asked me to come and do a Friday forum, which you see me there live doing. It sold out within 5 days of the announcement. There was a waiting list of over 100 people, and I was able to sort of talk about what we as a community can do to lift up the whole leadership issue. I also think it spoke to the issue of within a community, being the African American community, there still can be issues around inclusion. You know, even in your own community, you wrestle with these kinds of things. This next thing I'd like to talk about is something I've been involved with for the last 12 to 14 years. Partnering with Business Volunteers Unlimited, I was very active and have remained very active in creating a program for professionals of color to help them to get plugged onto nonprofit boards. The statistics say, ladies and gentlemen, that 86% of all people sitting on nonprofit boards in America are white. And we can probably not be surprised by the fact that a vast majority of the people that most of those agencies serve are people of color. So it only makes sense to try to recruit more people of color to have that perspective in the room. So we started back in 2006 and started doing them a couple times a year, all the way up to like 2012. We took a hiatus, and then just 2 years ago we started it again, and we're still getting good numbers. We've had over 400 people of color trained on nonprofit leadership, and about 130 of them have been successfully placed with local nonprofit boards. So that's something else that I think is important. This next picture, I shudder when I look at it because it brings up so much anxiety for me, but I was also the chairman, I was one of 8 individuals that served on the executive committee for Cuyahoga County government reform. You remember when we transitioned from the 3 county commissioners to the 1 executive? I see the First Lady of Cuyahoga County is with us. Thank you for being good to see you. I love you dearly.
I have some suggestions, by the way.
Okay, all right. Very good. But this was a public forum where 450 fired up people in the county wanted to know about this whole process and whether or not it was open and fair. And I happened to be also the chair of the Public Engagement Committee, so I had to sort of stand in front of that group and explain what we were doing. The best part of that story is that after that night, most of the people that were serving on this committee had been appointed by some governmental entity or political leader, and after that, so many people started coming to my meetings, and I at one seminal moment said, there's lots of open seats at this table. If you want to be involved, stop fussing about what's wrong, come and join us at the table.
Amen.
And people got up and came to the table, and these were everyday citizens that nobody knew, that no one had ever met, and they were the hardest working people that I've ever worked with, and they got it done, and we were successful in the end because of their efforts. So again, another perspective on inclusion, maybe socioeconomic, maybe people that just are everyday citizens that aren't plugged into the political framework but want to be involved. That was an effort that helped to change that. The last example I'll give before I close, I am also the co-founder of an operation known as the Randall Green Partnership. It's an urban farm, and some of you have heard of us. We are 10 years into our endeavor, and we started the urban farm mainly because we wanted to address the issue of health disparities. There was a study that came out maybe 8 years ago. One of the scholar, she was originally from Cleveland, but she resides somewhere else, and that study showed that there is a 24-year life expectancy difference between a resident living in the Huff neighborhood and a resident living in the Lyndhurst neighborhood. They're 7 miles apart, but there's a 24-year life expectancy difference. So we said, man, that is terribly wrong. We know a lot of that has to do with health and healthy diet and that kind of thing. So we farm raise tilapia fish, we grow all sorts of produce, we have a tree orchard, we teach classes on healthy eating, and it's been just a blast. But we think that health equity is a critical area that needs to be addressed. So in conclusion, I will say that diversity, speaking to the flyer as it was written, it is both a bottom-up and top-down commitment. I think it's been top-down for too long, and that's why we haven't had the kind of results that we hope for. I think that those of us that have experience typically or some type of familiarity are more likely to be committed to the cause longer term. If you don't know, if you're not talking to people, if you're not wrestling with this, you're probably not going to be as involved as you could be. What gets measured gets done in this space. You have to, especially in places like corporations, you have to not just listen to the happy talk, but really look at the statistics, look at the reality of who's in the C-suite, who's on the board, those kinds of things, and challenge companies to do better. And I also would like to say what gets done gets replicated, because when people can see effective models and tools, they're more likely to step up and try some of those things. So I would say to all of you as you think about this, to lean in on issues and matters involving diversity, try to experience it in any way that you can, wrestle with the challenges. The challenges do require some wrestling, and just, you know, at the end of the day, offer solutions. Some might work, some might not, but we really need to try new ideas. So with that, I will sign off, and hopefully we can get JP.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning, good. I apologize for the scarf, the voice, my tea.
Can I borrow it?
He said, can he borrow it?
Just fighting off a little cold here, but I'm very glad to be. I was very flattered to be asked to be here, and now I have to follow Randy, which is just great. And I think we have a lot of similar themes. I will do my best to keep this brief, but I will start off by saying that yes, I'm at a school of management. Yes, I'm in organizational behavior, but I'm not a diversity scholar or researcher or consultant. So Randy's sort of, you know, been a leader in that environment, much more than I think I have, at least. In my field of management scholarship, there's a subfield of diversity. So it's sort of not necessarily siloed, but it's its own thing, right? So you're either a diversity scholar or you're not, right? Which I think is a little problematic. And so some of my remarks will come from my reaction to that, some of which I shared about a year ago at a Power Diversity lecture at the Case Western Reserve University campus. Because I think it's very interesting. And the question to me is like, well, what can we actually learn if about diversity if you're not a diversity scholar, right? What is it that the sort of mainstream organizational behavior management field, what can we say? What lessons can be learned? And so it's a very interesting sort of thought experiment. So I just wanted to give that caveat that I am not a diversity scholar. And I would say I have a very varied background, but I'm also not a diverse person, right? Because you hear that used a lot. I always think that's very interesting. We need more diverse people. Well, that is somewhat factually incorrect, right? Because diversity is a property of a group, right? So no one person is diverse. I happen to be a permanent resident of the US, a green card holder. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a Catholic. I'm a gay man at the same time, so that's fun. A person of color in the United States. You know, I'm on the parish council of all places. And I'm at St. Malachy's Parish on the west side. And that has also gone through a similar process as your community has in merging two communities. So I see that sort of identity struggles, talking about diversity, even though people pretty much look all the same, right? But that set of diversity of ideas, diversity of identities, as Randy was pointing out, things that aren't as visible to the naked eye, can have maybe a lot more impact on how people treat each other and their ability to perform as a group, as a collective. And so that's where I come from, right? My field and what I care about is how do people come together to do something that they couldn't do on their own. To me, that's the fundamental aspect of organizing, of working as an organization, as a collective. And one of the things I've noticed is, so in our field, we want this, right? It's better when we're together. We want this. We want folks to care about each other and value each other. But as Randy pointed out, there is a distinct difference between diversity, which I've said is property of the group, right? You can talk about numbers of gay people, people of color, folks of different genders, but do we have inclusion, right? So do we have a sense of feeling seen and feeling valued for who you are, right? So as an organizational psychologist, I deeply care about that. You know, how is it that we make each other feel? And what's the effect of that on what we're able to do as a whole group? So, I think another observation from the field is that we've certainly come a long way in terms of things on the left side of the screen. You know, very explicit practices, particularly in the human resource realm, excuse me. But there's a very clear disconnect between those practices and people's felt sense of inclusion. Yes?
Could you read that?
Sure. Affirmative action is one example. And we know that that's been getting chipped away at. I saw that firsthand at the University of Michigan when I was there for both lawsuits. And then when affirmative action was stripped at the ballot. So imagine having to teach about this stuff at the same time. Equal opportunity, targeted recruiting, employee resource groups, right? So ERGs would be where organizations say, hey, we want folks of a particular affinity, whether it's knitting, biking, people of color, LGBT, like, hey, if you care about something, we're gonna give you some space and resources to hang out and support each other. So we know that, you know, throwing these things all together in organizations doesn't necessarily guarantee a sense of, I feel valued here, I feel welcome here. And again, to Randy's point, you may have an organization full of people of color, for instance, right? You may not necessarily feel included. And so some of what I think is interesting, and I will talk about just 3 things real quick, are that, you know, what is it that people are actually doing, right? So you get people in the room that with different ideas. In my field, you know, I study coordination, so you have folks of different expertise, different functionality, and what happens when you throw them all together? What can we do differently to ensure that felt sense of inclusion? So some of those things, I think, include developing a more reflective stance on our relationships, co-creating something concrete, basically giving folks something to do together, as simple as it sounds. And then what kinds of conversations we might have to better understand each other. So the first thing I'll say is that very often we operate on what Chris Argyris calls single loop learning, right? So we have an impression and then we run with it. And then what we find is that people tweet about it, right? Right? And even on the drive-in today, there's a great example actually, talking about the coronavirus, which I do not have. But they said, you know, what else can we think about in terms of getting the right information out about this virus? And the response was, people need to stop and think, would I make certain comments about this virus if it originated in a European country? How would I tweet about it if it originated in an African country? So this reporter is saying, are people stopping and checking themselves versus running with whatever impression they had first off the bat, right? So this may seem very effortful, and I think it is, right? But, you know, one example that comes to mind is Howard Stevenson, who's the director of Penn's Racial Empowerment Collaborative. So he and his group are trying to teach kids racial literacy, right? So they're trying to teach kids this level of mindfulness, right? Which is so hard for us adults to execute. So they're teaching kids to read the situation, read your reaction to it, recast your initial reaction. So basically, if you're feeling fear, anger, dread, take a second and just hold that space, right? Asking yourself, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling it? What self-talk and images are coming to mind? How do I manage this stress? Right? So those kinds of questions, are we asking ourselves those kinds of questions when we encounter difference, when we encounter things that are challenging? The second thing is giving folks something to do together. So there's some research that I really like when it looks at small teams in organizations. So these researchers looked at the three product development teams, and they did this thing called co-creating a scaffold. Right, so these teams basically, they just let folks throw out ideas, right? Just put it up on a board and say, what is it that we have? And giving everybody a chance to speak and contribute, right? So giving people something they could throw rocks at, as they called it. They didn't create common ground by glossing over differences and saying, oh, we only want to hear what's the same. They're like, we want to hear everything that's different, everything that's on everybody's minds from these different perspectives, right? So they got to common ground by creating what the researchers call a scaffold, right? So how are all these different inputs useful as a whole, right? But they took the time, my big takeaway is, they took the time to have everybody voice all these different ideas and then step back to say, well, what is it that we have here all together? And I think having that common task is really, really, really important. So we may have lots of folks that look different, that sound different, that have different backgrounds, but what is it that we're giving them to do together, right, to work towards? And the last thing I would say is, so I talked about being more reflective and mindful, having some sort of common task or scaffold that you can work on together. But then how do we talk with each other? And I think leaders and communities can set the tone for this, but ultimately it is a bottom-up process, right? So one example that comes to mind from my work is looking at different specialties coming together. So you imagine healthcare is moving towards more collaborative care models. At Case Western Reserve University, we just built, we have a health education campus with nurses and dental students and medical students all in one space, right? Because we know the future of healthcare is that folks have to work together as a team with the patient at the center. That doesn't happen very efficiently in our hospitals today, right? We're not there yet. So one intervention that I've seen is employing these conversations of interdependence between different specialties, right? Physicians, pharmacists, nurse anesthetists, nurse managers. So there's pretty targeted questions asking, all right, what is it that you find most meaningful about your work? What do I need from you? How does my work help your work, right? And then you find people coming up with responses like, you mean if you send a sample without an order, it just sits there? You have to throw out how much blood at the end of the day because it just hemolyzed or you never got an order? So if people don't actually spend some time away from the work to actually talk to each other about how they do their work and how they bring value to each other, you find there's a lot of waste and you find that patient care falls, right? So that's the idea of conversations, right? It can't be one-sided. There's a give and take. There's this idea of a self-reinforcing, a self-organizing set of a pattern that gets set up between two people. So are we creating spaces where, folks are able to have those conversations, those deeper conversations to get underneath the surface of what may seem to be the problem, right? So I'll just leave it there to say that we kind of have to accept, if we're going to change how we think, change how we act, change how we talk, that we can't predict everything. But at the very least, are we adopting a mindset of curiosity, flexibility, and experimentation? Do we bring that openness to each other when we're trying to create a more inclusive environment? And that's it for me.
Thank you. Before we start our questions, Susan's going to pass around a couple of clipboards if you want to be on our mailing list. We don't share this list with anybody. We never sell our mailing list. I'm sure a lot of people would pay big bucks for this mailing list, but we don't share it. We have a couple rules, 3 rules for questions and answers. The microphone holders choose the question asker. Please keep your questions short, don't make a speech. I know it's very tempting. And hold the microphone close to your mouth so everyone can hear.
I would like to thank both of our speakers, Mr. Stevens and Mr. McShepard, for a very fine presentation, and also thank you for the work that you do on behalf of diversity and inclusion. I have a question. It's always been one that perplexed me, and I seek your guidance. How to connect the dots between diversity and inclusion and actual social and economic justice for people of color. And an example of a corporation that has landmark policies in terms of mentoring executives and attorneys of color, getting them placed, and having them play meaningful roles in the corporation, and the social role that that corporation plays. For example, in taking away the health insurance from their employees, most of whom are men and women of color. Please.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of challenges, issues that corporate America faces, and there's a lot to unpack in your question. I guess I sort of see them as all equally deserving of attention and proper care. I think companies in today's world need to be responsible corporate citizens, and that includes the way they take care of their employees, the way they promote people of color, the way they do all those things. So I'll pick on my company as an example, RPM. We are very, very proud of the fact that we are probably one of 12 to 14 publicly traded companies out of the Fortune 500, 12 to 14 that still provide both a pension plan and a 401k. And our CEO deals with a lot of pressure from Wall Street, who says, why are you carrying a pension plan when most other companies are selling those plans off, give a slight bump to the 401k, and your employees won't know the difference? And he's saying, no, I care about our employees, I care about their families, I want them to have this kind of support, and I'm going to fight for it, and he has fought for it. So there's an example of a good policy by a corporation that is all about seeing to the care and feeding of the employees. Conversely, we probably have miles to go before we sleep as it relates to getting more people of color in the C-suite and in leadership positions. So it's certainly something that I'm very vocal about, and I'm trying to do my part, and it's something that the company isn't backing away from. The good news is that investors, the investor community, for the first time that I've seen in the last 2 to 3 years, they are now starting to hold corporations accountable. They're saying, we will not invest in your company if we do not see a diverse board of directors or a diverse C-suite or a diverse list of suppliers that you're buying from, et cetera, et cetera. So that, I think, will help a lot. I just think, one of the words that is in the flyer for this program, diversity, inclusion, and leadership, that's where leadership really pays dividends or walks away shamefully and ineffectively. I mean, I think leaders have to understand that the world is changing, that diversity is critical to our future as a nation and as a world, and that they have to step up and do the right thing. Now, not everyone agrees with that and not everyone does the right thing, but I think your question is spot on in that we ought to at least be wrestling with those issues and trying to be as comprehensive in how we think about taking care of people. And it can't be just one or the other, it has to be all of those things. It has to be meaningful programs, it has to be taking great care of employees and many other things.
I want to thank both of our speakers for excellent presentations. I have a question for both of you. As you can see, our audience is not racially diverse. And that's typical of houses of worship.
Yeah.
It's been said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. And I'd like either of you to, if you have specific suggestion of what we can do to invite and welcome people of color to join us.
Well, because I think this is an issue that St. Malachy's also has to deal with. So it's, I don't know if I have a great answer, but it's certainly something that I've experienced. Being on the Near West Side, being at St. Malachy's, as I'm sure your community does, trying to provide explicit outreach to neighboring communities of color in terms of meals and food, excuse me, and other support. But then, are you still inviting them to the actual table? And I think that happens too. I think that there's something about how people are being treated on the day-to-day on the street. Because you can say, hey, come show us, come please join us for 11:30 Mass, but then if you're still passing them right by or shutting them on the street, you know, you're parking your car and you're, you know, pulling your coat closer and you're walking a little faster as somebody's coming up to you from the projects down the street, then that sends a signal, right? There's a mismatch between join us at our table, but I don't want to look at you in the eye as I leave my car. So I think those kind of micro moments do matter. But I do think that, there's a lot more that houses of worship can do to create very explicit signals in terms of, for instance, being physically present in the community, maybe it's even door to door. I think remaining consistent in the messaging that, hey, when we say you're welcome here, we really mean that, and here's how we're going to show that in all these different ways, both big and small. I think it's involving communities of color in conversations around events, for instance. So how would putting on a huge event that would impact traffic circulation, that would impact who's in the neighborhood at a given point in time, have we asked the folks who live around us, who happen to be people of color, how they feel about this event? You know, what value and what reward will they get out of that event as well? So those are some things that come to mind. Again, I don't have a complete answer. I just acknowledge that it is a struggle, particularly as neighborhoods. You know, I'm on the Near West Side, so as it gets more and more gentrified, you know, who's getting pushed out, right? You know, what's happening to the church-going population and the population of people of color. So these are all, you know, it's just so much fluidity, and I don't know, we have to keep trying.
Yeah, I would agree with JP on that. Let's also keep in mind that houses of worship of any faith are seeing precipitous declines in attendance, right? And a lot of them are aging, and you know, you juxtapose that with the younger generations just doing things so much differently, being so technology focused, and I think part of it is trying to figure out what's the new church experience perhaps for the next couple of generations, because I don't think what all of us grew up experiencing will be necessarily what the future will hold, and I think that's why it's hard to get, in this particular example, younger people to come. I will say also that one of the proudest moments for me, I wasn't really involved, but as our company funded the effort, but just to sort of watch what happened with the Greater Cleveland Congregations effort, if you've heard about that, where churches, synagogues, you know, mosques all came together and addressed public policy issues as a collective. And there were 1,000 people that would show up from all, you know, walks of life. And I thought, you know, I presented to that group a couple of times, and it was really powerful to see that many people on the same accord. So that's the way you start to make those introductions and those connections, and you hope that you can build on it. I agree with the idea that it's always great to do those sessions where you, one Sunday a year, you maybe visit each other's church or have some sort of joint program so people can at least start to make connections and feel comfortable and know that they're welcome. And, you know, you drive past, you know, certain church buildings and you never know, you know, what's inside, and so to be able to go in and sort of experience it, it goes a long way. So, not that those are, you know, the panacea responses, you know, but I think it's the kind of actions that need to begin to take place to move us in that direction. But a great question.
My name's Grady Johnson. JP, you don't know me, but you should.
You should.
Randy's known me for ever, I think.
Yeah.
I have two responses. One to your question, you know, we have to go, I'm sorry. We need to go back and look at, you talk about churches and all the other good stuff. We haven't delineated the difference between spirituality and religion. The practice of religion is a vertical activity that has parameters. And historically it's been that way. We practice religion on Sundays for this tunnel, this tunnel, this tunnel. And until we grasp that, it's not gonna change. With JP, a lot of what he's talking about, my friends at Case, you talk about David Cooperrider with the Preacher of Inquiry. You may want to share some of that with this group. Ron Fry with team development, or Richard Boytis with emotional intelligence. Kind of learn these things and incorporate them into the whole push towards diversity and inclusion. I could give a lecture, I'm not going to do that. But let me ask our panelists question. There's a new movement, relatively new movement called the equity movement that's coming across America and beyond. And much of what you said could contribute to that. I'm working on a project up in Lorraine, introducing them to that. I've been down in Florida and I introduced them to it. I don't hear a lot about equity movement here in Northeast Ohio. Could you speak to the concept? No, you know of the equity movement. Maybe you could speak to it, please.
Well, you want to say a little bit more about, is it a formal, do you consider it now a formal movement?
It's a formal movement.
With specific objectives?
Yeah.
Because.
Yes, it's a formal movement. The one leading organization that's pushing it on a national level is called Policy Links. And they're out of Oakland, California. We met in April of last year, where it was introduced to another city in Florida, and it's a powerful oversight piece. We also separated equality from equity. Okay? And it's important to clear those up and what have you. So this organization, this esteemed body may want to learn more about it and incorporate that into some of our future dialogue and activity.
Thanks for that additional clarification. I would just say, Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of Policy Link, was very helpful to us when we started Policy Bridge, and was always someone who I could call, and I would see her at conferences and that kind of thing. She's been talking about equity for a long time, and I guess some cities are trying to get beyond the casual Black History Month chatter about, you know, the importance of equity and inclusion, and to really build it into the infrastructure of the way cities operate and the way they set goals and the way they think about how they define success. And so I hope that Cleveland will adopt it in a big way, and to do that you have to get the right leaders to step up and to own it. And that's what, I'll be frank, I've been frank about leadership for, you know, the last year. You know, I would hope that the right leaders in Northeast Ohio can step up and own it, and bring organizations together like yours to figure out how we can really do something that's really impactful.
I'm gonna sit down, okay, but we keep using the reference to leadership. There's a big difference between leadership and leader.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between leadership and leader. All right, a a leader, we're talking about characteristics of a person.
That's right.
It is a noun, all right? Leadership is a verb, it's an activity, all right? So separate the two and then address the issue of leader versus leadership. I too am a Weatherhead person, so don't mess with me.
Good morning, over here.
Oh.
First, apologies, Arman had planned to be here, but he's paying a condolence call in Boston.
Oh, okay.
So
Give him my best.
I will. I have about 4 questions and I'm gonna try to cram into one, so it's probably gonna be a mishmash. I'm asking 2 gentlemen, can you add your perspective on, for women, minority women, is there an added burden, responsibility when you are, and this is the second part of my question, invited to the table? There is initially this sense of, oh, I'm so grateful to be there, and you want to be liked and pleased, but you're a guest, and that transition from feeling, I'm not just a guest, I'm entitled to be there without alienating the already nervous people at the table. And then what happens when you all go home at the end of the day and we retreat to our neighborhoods, our communities, where we are not engaging with the people who we might see at the table to reinforce that we are a larger community?
Yes. Professor, please.
Sure, I can. Again, this is not my area of study, but I do have 2 students who are studying that right now. Both women of color. One's a VP at a large American bank. One was in the nonprofit world. So they were exploring in those arenas the experience of women of color. And so I think the question was about the added responsibility. So I would say yes, there is added responsibility and burden. Some of it is, at least from what I've been seeing and what I can intuit, is being overqualified, yet still undermined in the workplace. There's a sense of having to tread very carefully as a woman and a woman of color, that intersectionality, so that you're always trying to manage impressions. And as we all know, when we go to parties that we don't actually want to go to, right, it's psychically effortful. It takes a lot out of us to keep that smile on our face and shake hands. And then when you go home, you're like, thank God I'm home, right? So having to do that every day at work, I think would summarize some of what I've heard about from the data around women of color, particularly as they try to get into the C-suite. What I've also heard, and I don't know if this directly answers your question, is so one of my students, who again is currently a VP at a large bank, she assumed that sponsorship, mentorship was actually going to be like the key mechanism for explaining why women of color ended up in the C-suite. One, she found that there weren't that many women in the C-suite, and sponsorship wasn't really a thing in terms of majority people who are kind of reaching across hierarchical levels to say, I'm going to advocate for you, I'm going to help you get up here. Like, that's actually not happening as much as it should. But for folks who do arrive at the C-suite or near the C-suite, it's really that mutual support system that they've had to build on their own with other women of color. So I'm not quite sure what that says, what that means, but perhaps can organizations first pay attention to the lack of sponsorship, even though we know the research points out that that's a key mechanism. And then that for women of color, people of color, are we creating spaces where they can support each other? I think the part that you brought up around then going home and feeling unsupported or undervalued, I don't know if that's come up in the interviews and conversation, but I can imagine that again, sort of more localized, maybe just the family support systems, maybe all that they have. And I think I can imagine having to go to work and having to put in so much effort for diversity and inclusion, for your own survival, and then having to come home and feeling like you're being charged with that yet again in your neighborhood, in your community. It's just highly taxing. So what can we do? So the stress is what's coming out in the data. And what can we do to help mitigate that stress? So I don't know if that was more of a descriptive response to just corroborate that yes, there's a huge burden, but there's some support, but it's support that people are having to figure out and create on their own. It's not coming from the organization and not necessarily coming from the community.
Well played. I would just briefly say that it breaks my heart that Cleveland is #1 in the nation in infant mortality for women of color.